Hello and welcome back to this channel. Today is day 5 of your React challenge, and we are going to learn today importing and exporting of components. Let's start. You can declare many components in one file, but large file can get difficult to navigate. Okay, so it is always advised that we should keep or modulate our code as much as possible, because what it does, it helps us to debug if there is an error. It helps us to even understand the code better, and you can focus on a particular element at a time without making your code base much bulky. Now, to solve this problem or to attain modularity in your code, you can export a component into its own file and then import that component from another file. Okay, so basically you can just create a separate file where you can add a particular component and just import that file to your parent component. Like here, what they have done, they have created profile.js, which is a component, and they have added the images, and that profile.js first is exported here and imported in gallery, where you can add your component. One question on what do you guys think about the state of all these three components, whether it is same for them or it is different? Do answer this in chat or your comment section. Ready to learn this topic, RB? Yeah, pretty much. Read the importing exporting component to learn how to split the component into their own files. Let's open this. Importing and exporting components. The magic of components lies in its reusability. Okay, so first reason was modularity, the second reason is reusability. So if you have separate elements based component, you can reuse it again and again in your application. For example, if you have a component which is dedicated to only button, then you can use that component whenever you need button in any other function in your application. You can create components that are composed of other components. We have already seen this example in our profile and gallery.js example. But as you nest more and more components, it is often makes sense to start splitting them into different files. Why? Because it's easy to debug, it's easy to understand. This lets you keep your file easy to scan and reuse the component in more places. So we can write what is the use of importing and exporting the component. We can write exporting and importing lets you keep your file easy to scan and reuse the component in more places. What we will going to learn in this section, we will going to learn what a root component file is, how to import and export a component, when to use default and named imports and export, how to import and export multiple components from one file, how to split the component in multiple files. Okay, let's see what is a root component file. In your first component, you made a profile component and a gallery component that renders it. Okay, we have already seen this example. This currently lives in a root component file named app.js. So our root component file of React is app.js. root component file is app.js. Okay, depending on your setup, your root component could be in another file, though if you use a framework with file-based routing such as Next.js, your root component will be different for every page. Okay, this is very interesting. If you use a framework with file-based routing, so basically React is a component-based routing. Component-based routing is you can have same component in the same file and you can use routing, whereas file-based routing means you can just move from one file to another. To give you more clarity, suppose I have this app.js where I have two component, profile and gallery. So if I use React, I can go to this component using a route and other component using this route, whereas for Next.js I can't. I can go to app.js file but cannot go to this function particularly. So we can add this as well. I think somewhere we have a differences, right? Okay, the difference between Next.js and React. Okay, second is Next.js is a file-based routing, whereas React JS is component based. Awesome. Okay, exporting and importing a component. If you want to change the landing screen in the future and put a list of science book there, or place all the profiles somewhere else, it makes sense to move gallery and profile out of the root component. Okay, so if we want to change the structure of our app.js, or if we want to add some other components, some other data in our other components, it makes sense that we move them out of the root component and create their own component file. This will make them more modular and reusable in another file. You can move a component in 3 steps. Okay, first, make a new JS file to put the component in. Export your function component from that file using either default or named export. Okay, we will going to see what is the difference between default and named exports. Import it in the file where you will use the component using corresponding techniques for importing default or named export. So I'm going to add all these 3 steps to our notes. Basically, I'm going to add H3 here. How to add, how to export and import a component. Okay. Here both profile and gallery have been moved out of app.js into a new file called gallery.js. In gallery.js we have, okay, now you can change app.js to import from gallery. So we have something export default, and we're gonna call gallery import by using import. Notice how in this example is broken down into 2 component file. Now gallery.js define the profile component, which is only used with the same file and is not exported. So if I go to my gallery.js, we have function profile and it is not exported exports the gallery component as a default export. Exports the gallery component as a default export. Okay. App.js import the gallery as a default import. So there is a keyword default here. So what is the meaning of default? Basically it means that there is only one export present in your file. So here there is only one export, which is gallery. So by default, whenever you're importing anything from this gallery.js, it will be that function. That is why they are calling it a default. Export the root app component as a default export. Cool. Note, you may encounter file that leave off .js file extension like so. So suppose whenever there can be a chance, whenever you are importing here, instead of .js, they will just import gallery. This will not break your code. React will automatically understand if there is not any extension present in the file, it is a JS file. Now this is the deep dive. What is the difference between default and named export? So there are two primary ways to export values in JS, that is default export and name exports. Okay, so far our example we have used only default exports, but you can use one or both of them in the same file. A file can have no more than one default export. This is important. So when to use default export? When you want to export only one particular function or component. Okay, but if you have to export many other functions as well, you need to use named export. So for default export, you write export default and your function, whereas for named export you just write export. Okay, now you can have both of them as well, like you want to do a default export or named export as well. So for default you just write default, and whereas named just write export only. How you export your component dictate how you must import it. So to import default component is different the way you have to import your other components. You will get an error if you try to import a default export the same way if you want to named, if you would like to import the name export. How? Let's see. For default, export statement will have export default. Import statement will have import just the name of the function which you are exporting. Okay, whereas for named you just write export in your export statement, but for import you need to add curly braces. So basically whenever you write import from this file, it will have bunch of name of all the exports you want to which this files offer. So you have to specifically ask, okay, this particular function from all the export this file is doing, I want. Okay, so let's add few things to our nodes. Okay, default exports versus named. Okay, so default export, both you can use. A file can have only one default export, whereas it can have many named export. This is there. Now how to export, this is important syntax we're gonna copy. Okay, this is the syntax I have added. Okay. When you write a default import, you can put any name you want after import. For example, you could import banana from button.js. So when you do an export default, basically it will have only this function. So it doesn't matter what name you write here, because JS will know, okay, there is only one export, and if you are importing that in some other file, you must be mentioning that. So it doesn't matter what name. So what they're saying, instead of button, if you write import banana from button.js, that will still work. Whereas for named export, you have to be very careful what you are accessing it, because it is have a list of exports from that file. That file, and it's important to be very specific which import you want in your main component. People often use default export if the file export only one component, and use name export if the file export multiple components and value. Regardless of which coding style you prefer, always give meaningful names to your component function and the file that contains them. Okay. Component without names like export default this are discouraged because they are debugging harder. So always give a proper name to your function. Why? Because suppose you can do this, you can just directly get a function from a file using export default, but later on, if you are trying to debug the code or somebody else trying to read your code, they will find it very difficult to understand what exactly and where you are getting this data. So always try to make your and others' life more easy. Trust me, it takes you a long way. Exporting and importing multiple components from the same file, so we can do it using named export. If you want to show just one profile instead of a gallery, you can export profile component, but gallery.js already has default export, so you can't have two default export. You could create a new file with default export, or you can add a name export from profile. A file can only have one default but can numerous name. We have already covered that. To reduce the potential confusion between default and name export, some teams choose to only stick to one style, okay, or avoid mixing them in single file. It's a matter of preference. What works best for you. I'm gonna go for this suggestion. So basically, do not have mixed style of export, like here in the example we saw. Like in the same file you have named export as well as your default export. Don't do that. If you have a default export, create a separate file for them and export that. And if you have named export, create a separate file for them and have your multiple named exports there. Okay, cool. So we're good. Where were we? Yes, first export profile from gallery.js using the name export, no default keyword. Okay, now import profile to gallery.js to app.js. Okay, finally render it. Awesome. Now gallery.js contain two export, one default export, one named export. App.js import both of them. Try editing profile to gallery and back to this example. Okay, what they're trying to say, try editing a profile to gallery, and back to this. Okay, so instead of writing profile, I need to write gallery. Oops, the spelling is wrong. Okay, so if it is visible, you can see all the three scientists' name. If I go to my gallery.js, so if I write gallery, I will be accessing this amazing scientist with profile 1, 2 and 3. But if I am accessing only profile, I will get this image tag. Okay. Now you are using a mix of default and name export. Gallery.js export the profile component as named export called profile, and export gallery, this is same thing they are repeating. Okay, recap what we have learned today. We have learned what a root component file is. So what is a root component file? It is app.js present in our source folder. How to import and export a component? There are two ways to import or export a component. First way is default. When you have to import only one component, you use default. Whereas if you want to import multiple components, you should use named. When and how to use default and named, I have already explained this. How to export multiple files from the same file, you just write export, and in import you use curly braces and the name of the file you want to import. Try out some challenges. Okay, great. Challenge 1 of 1, split the component further. Currently gallery.js export both profile and gallery, which is a bit confusing. Move the profile component to its own profile.js and then change the app component to render both profile and gallery one after the other. Okay, you may use either a default or a name export, but make sure that you use corresponding input syntax in both app.js and gallery.js. Okay, you can refer the table from the deep dive. Awesome. So we have profile.js. So what I'm going to do, I'm just gonna copy this, or sorry, cut this or remove this control X. I'm going to add it here. So this is my profile.js, and I'm going to add a default here because we are using only one function, so it makes sense to use a profile here. I'm going to import my profile first to my gallery.js. Okay, let me check whether, yeah, profile and gallery.js. Okay, and I'm gonna remove this import which is in app.js. I'm gonna import profile from profile.js. Oh, it should be capital P. Okay, and there should be no dots here. Okay, now it's working. I can see my profile here, and the second challenge, second thing they have mentioned here, yeah, render both profile and gallery one after the another. So after profile or before profile, I'm gonna render gallery to see if gallery actually works. As you can see, gallery has 3 profiles images and profile is having only 1. So it's working. Cool. So this is what importing and exporting in React.js component looks like. I hope it helped you to understand how to import and export files and components in your React. And for the next step, what I would say, try to play with this as much as possible. You know, create your own project, write your exports and imports, and check how to work. And I'll see you in the next segment, which is writing markup with JSX. Thank you so much for joining. Have a nice day. Bye bye. Take care.